"You can't be serious," Sylvia said, and her voice came out, smaller than she'd meant it to, barely a whisper. The kind of sound a person makes when the ground drops out from under them. Her uncle didn't look up from the table. He just turned the papers over, one by one, like he was sorting grain. Outside the window of the farmhouse, the last snow of March was coming down in heavy, wet clumps, the kind that broke branches. "It's already settled," Reginald Ashby said. He was her mother's brother, a man who had taken her in at 23, when her parents died of fever on the road from Thunder Bay, and who had reminded her of that fact every year since. "You'll go Thursday. He'll come for you Thursday morning." "Who will?" Sylvia asked. "Who is this person?" "Grover Tull." Reginald finally looked at her. His eyes were the flat color of old ice. "He's got land west of Carleton Place. 160 acres, maybe more. He's a fair man. You don't even know him. I know his foreman. And I know what I owe, and I know what I can't pay." He pushed back from the table. "You're 24, Sylvia. You're not a child." That was the last thing he said about it. He went out to the barn, and Sylvia stood alone in the kitchen with the smell of wood smoke and old grease, and she thought, "So this is what I am worth to him. A cleared debt. An arrangement made between two men over cards or whiskey or some quiet handshake she'd never been part of." She did not cry that night. She had learned, somewhere along the years in that house, that crying changed nothing and cost something. She packed her trunk instead. Her 2 good dresses, the brown wool coat her mother had left her, the small Bible with the cracked spine. She packed slowly and carefully, like a woman who intended to take her dignity with her, even if she couldn't take much else. Grover Tull arrived on Thursday as promised, just after dawn. Sylvia had expected something rough. A loud man, red-faced, the kind who would look her over like livestock at a fair. What she saw instead was a man of about 45, with gray at his temples, and the kind of stillness that comes from years spent alone. He wasn't large, but he was solid. He wore a clean jacket, despite the mud on the road, and he took his hat off when he came to the door, which she hadn't expected. He didn't say much. He nodded to Reginald, who didn't come out to see her off. He carried her trunk to the wagon himself without being asked. When she climbed up onto the seat, Sylvia looked back at the house once. The curtain in the kitchen window didn't move. She turned forward and didn't look again. They rode for nearly 2 hours without speaking. The road west of Carleton Place was rough going in the March thaw, and the horses picked their way around the worst of the ruts. Sylvia sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the countryside open up, scrub pine giving way to open fields, the Ottawa Valley spread out flat and gray under the heavy sky. Finally, without looking at her, Grover Tull said, "I want you to know something." She waited. "I didn't ask for this arrangement," he said. "Your uncle approached my foreman. I was told you were willing." He paused. "I can see now that might not be the whole truth." Sylvia looked at him. "Would it have changed anything if you'd known?" He seemed to consider the question seriously. "I'd like to think so," he said at last, "but I can't say for certain. A man in a hard season doesn't always ask the questions he should." That was an honest answer. She hadn't expected honesty. "What do you expect of me?" she asked. "In your house, someone to keep it," he said. "Cook, keep order. The place has gone to ruin since." He stopped, started again. "I've been managing alone for 3 years, it shows." Since what, she thought. But she didn't ask, not yet. The farm was called Tull's Crossing, though there was no sign to say so. Just a gate with a broken latch and a long muddy lane leading back to a white clapboard house that needed paint. Behind it stood a barn in better repair than the house, which told her something about the man's priorities. A hired hand named Amos, who was about 16 and looked permanently startled, came out of the barn to take the horses. He stared at Sylvia with open curiosity. "That's Amos," Grover said. "He doesn't mean anything by the staring." "I know," Sylvia said, and she smiled at the boy, who went red to the ears and looked at his boots. The inside of the house was exactly what she'd expected. Functional and cheerless. The dishes were clean, which surprised her. but the floors hadn't been swept in a week, and there was a curtain missing from the front window. A cat slept on top of the woodbox and regarded her without moving. "That's Nib," Grover said. "She's been here longer than me, I think. Don't try to move her." Sylvia set down her coat. "I wouldn't dream of it." She found the kitchen in reasonable working order and put together a proper supper that night. Salt pork, potatoes, and biscuits from a tin of flour she found in the pantry. When Grover came in from the fields, he stopped in the doorway and looked at the table as though he'd forgotten what a set table looked like. He ate without complaint, ate everything on his plate and didn't speak much, but at the end he said, quietly, "That was better than I've had in a long while." It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was more like something a man says when he's been hungry for a long time and doesn't quite know how to admit it. The first weeks were a negotiation without words. Sylvia learned the rhythms of the place. Grover up before dawn, out to the barn, back in by 7 for coffee and nothing else, gone again until noon. He didn't hover. He didn't ask her to account for her time. She had expected a man who would watch her like she was something borrowed, something he wanted his money's worth from. Instead, he moved through the house like a man who had learned to take up as little space as possible. She made it her business to understand what the house needed. The curtain she rehung with a piece of cotton from her own trunk. The floors she swept and then scrubbed. She found a cracked window sash in the back bedroom and stuffed a rag into it until Amos could be asked to fix it properly. She also found, in the room at the end of the hall with the door always pulled to, a woman's things. A hairbrush on the dresser. A pair of leather gloves folded on the shelf. A quilt on the bed that someone had pieced with care, small squares of blue and green, in a pattern she recognized as a grandmother's flower garden. She didn't touch anything in that room. She pulled the door closed again and went back to the kitchen and started on bread, because bread was something she could do with her hands when her mind was too full. She learned his wife's name from Amos, who talked freely when he was working, and didn't notice that he was the only one doing so. "Margaret," the boy said. "She died 3 winters ago," he said. "Fever. Same as Sylvia's parents," she thought, though she didn't say so. "He don't talk about her," Amos said, splitting kindling. "Not to nobody." Sylvia said nothing. "But he kept everything," the boy said. And somehow that said more than anything else could have. It was the 4th week when the trouble started. Her name was Dorothea Fenn, and she arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a buggy driven by her son, who stayed outside. Dorothea Fenn was about 60, with a sharp face under a good hat and the kind of manner that had been mistaken for many years for respectability. She was Grover Tull's nearest neighbor to the east, and she had known him for a long time, and she had a daughter. Sylvia would learn this gradually, whom she had considered a suitable prospect for Grover's company. Dorothea didn't introduce herself. She came into the kitchen as though she already lived there, looked Sylvia up and down, and said, "You're the girl he took in." "I'm Sylvia Ashby," Sylvia said, and kept her voice pleasant. "May I offer you tea?" "Took in from some arrangement," Dorothea continued, as if she hadn't heard. "I heard about it from the Pedersons. I wasn't going to come, but I thought someone ought to see what was what." Sylvia set the kettle on the stove. "You're very young," Dorothea said, which was not a compliment. "I'm 24, Sylvia said. "And what is it you did before this? Your people?" "My parents passed when I was 23. I was living with my uncle." The woman looked around the kitchen with the eyes of a woman doing a hostile inventory. "You've moved things around." "The pantry was arranged oddly," Sylvia said. "It made more sense to put the dry goods closer to the stove. Margaret had it a certain way." "I know," Sylvia said. "But Margaret isn't here." It came out quietly, without cruelty, but it was the kind of truth that lands hard anyway. Dorothea Fenn looked at her with a flicker of something that might have been surprise, and then her face closed back up into its usual arrangement. She stayed for 40 minutes and drank the tea and said nothing kind. When she left, she told Sylvia that she hoped the situation would work out to everyone's satisfaction. in a tone that suggested she had her doubts. Sylvia watched the buggy go down the lane and then went back to her bread. She didn't mention the visit to Grover that evening. It didn't seem worth raising. What she didn't know was that Dorothea had gone directly to see him the next morning while Sylvia was in the vegetable cellar taking stock of what had survived the winter. She didn't hear what was said, but she came up the cellar steps to find Grover standing at the kitchen door with an expression she hadn't seen before, something tightly held, careful. "Mrs. Fenn came by yesterday," Sylvia said before he could speak. He looked at her. "She told me. She had concerns," Sylvia said. "She did." He leaned against the doorframe. "She told me you were rearranging things, that you were." He seemed to search for the word Dorothea had used. "Overstepping." Sylvia set the jar of carrots she was holding down on the counter. "Do you believe that?" He was quiet for a moment. "I believe the pantry needed reorganizing," he said at last. "I couldn't find anything in there for 3 years." It wasn't what she'd expected. She felt something ease in her chest just slightly. "But I should have asked," she said, "about Margaret's things. I should have asked what you wanted left as it was." He was quiet again, longer this time. "You left her room alone," he said finally. "Yes. Then you already understood what mattered." He picked up his hat from the hook. "Mrs. Fenn means well. She just—" He paused. "She doesn't know what she doesn't know." He went out. The door closed quietly behind him. Sylvia stood in the kitchen for a moment, alone with the cat and the sound of the wind off the valley, and she thought, "I think I can trust this man." It was a small thought, but it was the first one of its kind she'd had in a long time. Spring came properly in late April, and with it, more work than she had imagined. She helped Amos clear the kitchen garden, which had gone largely to weeds, and replanted it with the seed packets she'd found in the barn. Beans, turnips, onions, and a row of sunflowers she put without asking because she thought they would be good for something, even if only for looking at. She found that she was stronger than she'd realized, or maybe she'd always been strong and simply hadn't had occasion to discover it. Her back ached at the end of the long days, but it was the good kind of aching, the kind that meant something had been done. Grover never thanked her in words, but she noticed the small things. The way he began to linger a few minutes longer at the table after supper, before heading out to the barn for his last chick of the evening. The way he had started to ask her opinion on minor things. Whether the north fence needed doing before the south one. Whether she thought the cellar window ought to be replaced before next winter. He asked these questions like a man who was out of practice, asking anyone, anything. And she answered them the same way she did everything, honestly, and without making too much of it. One evening in early May, he came in from the fields with a piece of muddy cloth in his hand, which turned out to be an old cap, the kind a child might wear. He set it on the table and looked at it for a moment without speaking. "Was it yours?" she asked, though she suspected differently. "No," he said. "I found it near the east fence, near where Margaret used to." He stopped, began again. "She liked to walk out that way in the evening." Sylvia looked at the cap. Then she looked at him. "Is it hers?" "No," he said again. "It was too small. I don't know who it belonged to. Some passerby years ago." He seemed faintly embarrassed by having brought it in at all. "I shouldn't have kept it. Grief doesn't follow a sensible path," Sylvia said. He looked at her then. Really looked at her, the way he hadn't in all the weeks she'd been there. Like he was seeing something he hadn't expected. "No," he said. "It doesn't." He didn't say anything else. He put the cap in the woodbox and washed his hands for supper. But something had shifted between them, quietly and without announcement, the way the light changes in a room when someone opens a window. The trouble with Dorothea Fenn came to a head in June. There was a gathering at the Pedersen farm, a working bee, the women coming to quilt, and the men to help raise a new section of barn. It was the kind of community event that happened 2 or 3 times a year in the valley, and Grover told her she was welcome to come or to stay home, whichever she preferred. She went. She thought it was important to go. She wore her better dress, and she brought a pie she'd made from the last of the winter-stored apples, and she arrived with Grover in the wagon and felt the particular sensation of a room that is not quite sure what to make of you. Most of the women were kind enough in a guarded way. They accepted her name, accepted the pie, made space for her at the quilting frame. An older woman named Hazel sat beside her and asked sensible questions about where she'd come from and how she was finding the valley, and Sylvia answered honestly and liked her for the straightforwardness of it. And then Dorothea Fenn came and settled herself across the frame. She didn't speak to Sylvia directly at first. She spoke around her, to the other women, in that particular way some people have of treating someone as though they are not present when they are very much present. She talked about the spring planting and her daughter's news from Ottawa and the state of the roads, and then with the seamlessness of someone who had planned it, she said, "It's a strange arrangement, of course, taking in a girl like that." I suppose Grover felt sorry for her. He always had a soft heart for strays. The table went very quiet. Sylvia kept her needle moving, one stitch, then another. "I'm not a stray," she said pleasantly into the quiet. "I have a name and I have a place, but I appreciate the concern." Several women looked at their fabric. Hazel, to her credit, made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Dorothea's face went tight. "I only meant—" "I know what you meant," Sylvia said. She looked up and met the woman's eyes directly, calmly, without malice. "You meant that I came to Grover's household in an unusual way, and that you're not sure what I am to it. I understand that. It's a reasonable thing to wonder." She put her needle in and drew it out again. "But I'll tell you what I am, since you're wondering. I'm the woman who keeps that house, and keeps it well, and I intend to go on doing so." The conversation at the table turned to other things after that, slowly and with some relief, and Sylvia went on quilting. But she had felt, even with her eyes on her work, the presence of something shifting, some invisible weight redistributing itself in the room. She thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. 2 days later, Dorothea came again to Tull's Crossing. This time Grover was in the yard. Sylvia was inside, at the kitchen window, and she couldn't hear the words. Just the particular cadence of Dorothea's voice, rising and falling with the authority of a woman making a case. She could see Grover standing with his arms at his sides, hat in hand, head slightly bowed the way he had when he was listening carefully to something. Then she heard him. She couldn't hear the words that time, either, but she heard the tone shift, the quiet, deliberate weight of it, and she saw Dorothea stop talking. She saw the woman look up. She saw Grover say something else, still quietly, still without raising his voice, and she saw Dorothea's face change. Not dramatically, not with tears or shouting, just that small, hard deflation of someone who has miscalculated. Dorothea Fenn got back in her buggy without being invited in. The buggy turned at the gate and went east along the road. Grover came inside and hung his hat on the hook and didn't immediately say anything, which was not unusual for him. Sylvia poured coffee and set it on the table without asking, which he had come to expect from her. He sat down and wrapped his hands around the cup. "She told me you were trouble," he said at last, "that you were getting above yourself, that I ought to send you back before things got complicated." Sylvia sat across from him. "What did you say?" He looked at the cup for a moment. Then he said, "I told her that you had done more for that house in 3 months than I had managed in 3 years. And I told her that what happened between me and the Ashby family was my business and nobody else's, and that if she had concerns about my household, she was welcome to keep them to herself." Sylvia looked at him. "I should have said it sooner," he said. "I let her run on too long. That was my fault." "It wasn't," she started. "It was," he said. He looked up at her, and in his face she saw something that hadn't been there before, or that had been there, and she'd only now got close enough to recognize it. "You've not done a single thing that needed defending. I should have made that plain from the start." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a crow called once from the direction of the barn and then was still. "Thank you," Sylvia said. And she meant it with everything she had. Summer came the way Canadian summers do in the Ottawa Valley. All at once, generous and brief, the fields going green almost overnight, and then gold, the sky enormous and blue in a way that made the long winters seem like a different country. Sylvia loved it more than she had expected to. She had not thought, in those bleak March weeks, that she would come to love anything about this place. But she found she loved the early mornings when the mist lay over the lower fields. She loved the kitchen garden she had brought back from ruin. The rows of beans climbing their poles, the sunflowers she'd planted on a whim standing taller than she was, and facing east, like they had somewhere important to look. She loved Amos's cheerful incompetence, which was slowly improving under her patient corrections. She even loved Nib the cat, who had finally condescended to sleep at the foot of her bed instead of the woodbox. She loved, though she had not yet named it to herself, the evenings, after supper, when the long July light was still in the sky and the heat had eased a little. Grover had taken to sitting on the porch steps. He didn't suggest she join him. He didn't suggest she not. She simply found herself there, more nights than not, sitting one step below him with her hands in her lap, and the sound of the peepers from the creek filling up the air between them. They talked. Not always about anything important. About the fields, about what needed doing, about the news from the Pedersen farm. Sometimes about her, her parents, her years with her uncle, the life she'd had before. He listened well. He never offered pity, which she appreciated more than she could say. He offered sometimes a kind of rueful recognition, the response of someone who had also known what it was to be in a situation not of their making, and to simply have to carry it. "Did you ever want to leave?" she asked him once, meaning the farm, the valley, the whole arrangement of his life. "After Margaret died," he said, after a pause. "For about a year, I wanted to leave everything. Why didn't you?" He seemed to think about it genuinely. "I don't know," he said. "Couldn't think of anywhere else I'd rather be, which isn't the same as wanting to stay, but it kept me here." She thought about that for a while. "I understand that," she said. He didn't say anything, but she felt, without seeing it, that he had looked at her. It was Amos who made things plain, in the way that young people sometimes do without meaning to. He came in from the barn one September morning with manure on his boots and an expression of elaborate innocence, which in Sylvia's experience meant he was about to say something awkward. "Can I ask you something?" he said, pulling off his boots at the door. "If it's brief," she said. "Are you going to stay?" he said. "Permanent, like?" She turned from the stove. "What makes you ask that?" He shrugged with the whole body commitment of a 16-year-old. "He's different," Amos said. "He talks more. He don't look at the floor when he comes in at noon." He paused. "He laughed yesterday, out by the fence. I didn't know he still did that." Sylvia was quiet for a moment. "He laughed at me trying to fix the gate," she said. "It was a reasonable thing to laugh at." "He didn't used to," Amos said simply, and went to wash his hands. She stood at the stove for a while after that, turning it over. She thought about Margaret's room, which she still hadn't opened, and the quilt in there that someone had pieced with love, and the hairbrush on the dresser, and the leather gloves. She thought about grief that didn't follow a sensible path. She thought about a man who had kept everything and said nothing. For 3 years, until a woman arrived in his wagon on a Thursday morning and brought bread and a cat treaty, and the quiet knowledge that some things can be honored without being held onto forever. She didn't know what to call what was between them. She wasn't sure yet that she needed to. In October, her Uncle Reginald wrote a letter. It was brief and businesslike. He was well, he said. The debts were settled. He hoped she was situated comfortably. He asked, in the final line, if she thought she might be coming back in the spring, as there was work that could use a pair of hands. She read it twice. She set it on the table. Grover came in at noon, read the situation from her face the way he had learned to, and sat down without speaking. She showed him the letter. He read it without comment and set it back down. "What do you want to do?" he said. She looked at him across the table. "I want to know what you want," she said. "Not what you feel obligated to, or what the arrangement says. What you actually want." He was very still for a moment. Outside, the October wind was coming off the valley, rattling the last leaves from the maple by the barn. Inside, the kitchen smelled of bread and coffee and something she had come to think of, quietly and without announcement, as home. "I want you to stay," he said, "if you're willing to, not because of the arrangement." Because, he stopped, looked for words in the careful way of a man who did not use them extravagantly. "Because I would miss you. Every part of every day, I would miss you." She felt something happen in her chest that she had no name for, yet but recognized as important. "Then I'll stay," she said. He nodded, once. And then quietly, he reached across the table and put his hand over hers and left it there. Just that, just the weight of it, warm and steady and deliberate, the gesture of a man who didn't make gestures lightly. She turned her hand over and held his. The letter from her uncle stayed on the table until she got up to clear the dishes, and then she put it in the wood stove, and that was that. She wrote her own letter, instead, to a woman she'd known briefly in Carleton Place. A woman who had been kind to her once at the dry goods store and left her address. She didn't say much. She said she was well. She said she had found a good place, and she thought she meant to stay in it. She said the Ottawa Valley was lovelier in autumn than she had expected, and that she had grown sunflowers, and that they had come to a height she was proud of. She did not say, "I came here in March as something less than a person, in the eyes of the man who should have loved me, and I have become, in the months since, someone I recognize and even like." She didn't need to say it. She knew it. That was enough. The first snow came in November, early and serious. The way the valley snow comes when it means business. Sylvia and Grover spent the day before the storm, bringing in the last of the wood and checking the barn, and Amos stuffed the last of the drafts in the old part of the house with the strips of flannel she'd cut from a worn-out shirt. The cat watched all of this from her position on the woodbox, with the expression of a creature who has seen many winters and is confident this one will also be survived. That evening, with the snow beginning to come down in earnest past the windows, they sat at the kitchen table after supper, not on the porch steps, too cold for that now, but inside, in the yellow warmth of the lamp. She was mending a seam in one of Amos's shirts. He was going over the accounts, which he did at the end of each month, always with the same small frown that eventually resolved into satisfaction. At some point he looked up and said, "I want to ask you something properly, if that's all right." She set down the mending. He put his pen down carefully. He was not a man who performed things, and so what he said next had no performance in it at all. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because it's sensible, though it is. Not because of the arrangement, which we've both agreed to leave behind. But because you have made this place." He looked around the kitchen briefly, as though seeing it. "You've made this a home again, and I did not think, 3 years ago, that I would say that sentence again in my life." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the wagon ride west in the March snow, and the trunk she'd packed with her 2 dresses and her mother's Bible, and the kitchen she'd scrubbed, and the curtain she'd rehung, and the garden she'd brought back to life. She thought about all the things she had built here, quietly and without being asked. "Yes," she said. Simply as that. He exhaled, not dramatically, just the slow release of a breath, long held. He reached across and took her hand again, and she thought, this is what it looks like when a good man has been afraid to hope, and then finds out he was allowed to, after all. The snow came down past the window. Nib settled deeper into the woodbox. The lamp made its small, warm circle in the kitchen, and inside that circle, the two of them sat, with their hands together, and the accounts forgotten and the mending forgotten, and nothing pressing anywhere in the world. She had come to this place with nothing she had chosen and had found, by some combination of stubbornness and grace, everything she needed. That was the thing about a hard beginning. It didn't have to be the whole story.